I'm going to also talk about addiction, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it on the more of the biological side, what's happening in the brain to kind of understand, because before I started studying this, I would always ask the question, given the amount of damage that they're doing to themselves and to family members, why can't they just stop, right? I mean, clearly they're seeing the damage that's done to themselves as well as done to others. So what's going on that's preventing them from just stopping? So we'll kind of get into that right now. So I'm going to give you a couple of mythbusters, like a mythbuster section. So the first thing that I want to ask is, why do most people end up doing drugs? Is it because of the high, that they love the high, or is it for some other reason? Escape, right? And sometimes it's the high. And a lot of times I thought it was the high, but actually if you talk to several addicts, right, at a certain point, they can actually no longer reach a high. They're actually not doing it for the high. They actually will tell you, I can't get the high, right? But the reason I'm actually doing it is just so that I can actually function, just so that I can actually just live, right? Just so that I can feel normal. I was talking to one of my youth that's been struggling with a long time, and he's on heroin, and he told me that same thing. I take it so that I can stand, so I can physically stand, and he says, I no longer can get high. And so you'll hear quotes like this. When I first started, I remember having a huge reaction to a small amount of speed. Inside of a year, I could shoot a spoon of it easily, which is a pretty fair amount. And it finally got to the point where I couldn't even sleep unless I had done some. Another quote from a 36-year-old recovering heroin addict. When we were really strung out on heroin, we were spending $150 to $200 a day to feel normal. It's one thing to spend that kind of money and get loaded, but when you're spending that kind of money just to function as a human being, it's irritating. He himself is irritated, right? Another thing to kind of keep in mind, we know that people can go ahead and overdose, right, from taking too much drugs. But can you actually die from not taking the drug? So if I just decide to stop taking drugs, that'll kill me. Actually, yes. Depends on the drug. So not all drugs work that way. So actually, depending on the drug, you can actually die from not taking it. The withdrawal symptoms are so bad that the withdrawal symptoms will physically kill you. This is not true for all drugs, but it's true for several of them. Alcohol, a lot of the opioids, you can actually die from not taking them. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is the majority of the people actually that I interact with, oftentimes the reason that they're taking drugs is to avoid the withdrawal symptoms. That's all that they're really trying to do. And they will say that they know that it's messing up their lives, but they are so scared of experiencing the withdrawals. And that's what keeps them going. So one of the things that I like oftentimes telling people is the worst thing that you can probably actually tell an addict is just stop. That's actually probably the worst advice you can ever give someone. And that's what I used to do. But then until I started studying it, because a lot of times we have a hard time accepting the idea that addiction is a brain disease. But if you think about it, let's kind of give an example. Let's say, all that you kind of eat is just junk food, right? That's actually kind of like my meals every day, but that's okay. All right, so that's all you eat, right? And so as a result, right, all of that junk food is going to go ahead and mess with your heart. Now, because now you have a messed up heart, you have an enlarged heart, you now have high blood pressure. So that now is a symptom of the enlarged heart. Now imagine, let's say if it's Dr. Kitty, right? I see that you have high blood pressure. Please go ahead and lower your blood pressure. Go ahead, do it. Do it now. We laugh because is she in control of that blood pressure? No, it's a symptom of the messed up heart. And if you look at it, we can actually do the same analogy with the brain. I guess I'm done. Okay. All right, there we go. Okay. That's one way to tell me I'm over my time. Okay. All right. It's the same concept, right? You go ahead and take drugs, that's going to go ahead and affect your brain. Now that you have a messed up brain, one of the symptoms of that messed up brain is now you no longer have control, or you have very little of that control. And it's the same thing as if you were to go ahead and tell someone, lower your blood pressure. It's the same thing as if you go to someone who's been taking drugs and is a true addict, just stop. Actually, a lot of times they'll tell you, I want to stop. I just don't know how. And a lot of times people have a hard time with this idea. And I tell them, if you were actually to go ahead and just give me a scanner, right, like an fMRI scanner, I don't even have to interview, right, if you give me a normal person, a non-addict, and an addict, I can just put them in a fMRI machine, and I can tell you who the addict is. Because I can just look at their brain. So it's important that we kind of understand this thing, because if you think about it, we sometimes treat, right? A lot of us understand that addiction is a medical disease, a biological disease, but sometimes how we deal with it is not so much, because we actually treat it more of as a legal problem versus a medical problem, right? So one of the things to kind of keep in mind is why drugs are so powerful in that they can go ahead and make you do things that normally and you yourself know is wrong. It's because pretty much all drugs work on a chemical in your brain called dopamine. And what this does is actually, dopamine actually goes ahead and is the drug that tells your body that this action, this thing is important. And it keeps you doing something over and over, right? There was actually a really messed up study where they took some rats, they took all the dopamine in this pathway out, they gave it food, they gave it water, they gave it mates, right? The rat ended up dying. Even though it had all the food, all the water, because there was no dopamine to continue telling it to do that, reinforce that behavior. If you actually look at dopamine levels, at least physiologically, the greatest action that you can do to go ahead and physiologically, under normal conditions, increase levels of dopamine is sex. Sex will go ahead and increase your levels of dopamine by about 100 units. And that's the highest physiological max that you can get to. If you look at, that's about 100. If you look at most drugs, it's over 1,000. And now that kind of starts making sense why, if you think about it, right? Drug addicts will go ahead and do pretty much anything and everything for drugs, including not eating, not caring about family, right? All of that kind of stuff because it hijacks that system, that natural system. And we've actually seen that a lot of times we know that there is a predisposition to this, because one study found that they're in most addicts, they have this gene. And what this gene does is that it actually gives you less dopaminergic receptors in your brain. So the idea is, let's say two people, right? One goes ahead and goes to Magic Mountain, gets a job, gets a job promotion, gets an A. Well, because they already have enough dopamine in their system, when they go ahead and do that, that gives them pleasure. That gives them enough of a high, a natural high, that they like that. But usually what is believed to happen in those with this receptor, because they don't have that, they don't have enough dopamine, what ends up happening is their pleasure threshold is very high. So they don't get pleasure from a lot of normal things that most of us would go ahead and get. So you can have two people who end up taking, let's say, shooting up once. One person will end up saying, okay, I got my high for that one time, right? An experience. The other person will now go ahead and become addicted, because the normal person says, well, I've gotten other things that have given me what highs. The person that has that high threshold, this is the very first time that I've ever what? Felt good in my life. And so they are more likely to go ahead and now what? Continue doing that drug or whatever it may be. If you think about it, most people who actually overdose, right, they actually don't really overdose in their homes. They usually overdose, you always hear it on the news, they'll usually overdose at a hotel or a gas station. Why? Is it because, well, they don't want to make their house dirty because they're gonna, overdose, so, let's go to some new place, right? Well, actually, I would say probably about 90% of people who overdose on drugs, they've taken the same amount of drugs that they've taken before. It's a misnomer. Most people think that overdose, you've taken more drugs than you've taken before, and now all of a sudden you've killed yourself. The truth of the matter is actually most people that overdose, they usually overdose in new places because their brain hasn't adapted to that new place. So kind of give you an example. Let's say I go ahead and go to my basement and shoot cocaine. No one quote me on that, okay? I go to my basement and shoot cocaine. And I keep doing this over and over and over. What ends up happening is my brain starts making memories that every time I go into this basement, I know I'm about to shoot up. So what my brain goes ahead and does is my brain actually reduces my natural amounts of dopamine so that the next time I go down there, I actually don't get that same high. So I need to now shoot up more. Part of the reason why you get tolerance. So let's say I keep doing that, right? My brain, so that very first time I take that drug, right, is gonna now go ahead and give me a real good high. But I keep doing it over and over, right? What's eventually gonna happen is my brain, because it wants to stay at homeostasis, it wants to stay at that normal level, is gonna do the opposite effect of the drug. So I go to my basement, I see that thing, it's gonna go ahead and lower, it's gonna do the opposite effect. So what I end up actually experiencing is not that much of a high. But then let's say I go ahead, my friend calls me over and he says, hey, why don't you go ahead and come do drugs at my place? I go over there, my brain doesn't have that compensatory response, and now I've just overdosed. And actually, if you think about it, that's why a lot of times people do really, really, really great when they're at a rehab center. They can go 7 months, a year, then they come back, then what almost always happens? They relapse. Why? Because they're now back in their environment. They see all of those things, your brain sees those images, it reminds them of drug administration, lowers that dopamine levels, and then you end up getting this intense craving that you're more than likely not going to be able to resist, right? Think about how hard that is, right? let's say you're a heroin addict, right? And you decide you no longer want to go ahead and do drugs. And you say, that's it, I'm done. Then you happen to go to your nurse pulls up a needle. Your brain sees needle, what does it think it's going to get? Drugs. So it goes ahead and lowers that dopamine level. You go ahead and now have a strong craving, and you're more likely to go ahead and relapse. I know of a person who was 17 years sober, hadn't done drugs for 17 years. He happened to run into a person he used to do drugs with 17 years ago. That night he relapsed. Because your brain makes those memories. And he didn't know why, but he got that strong craving because your brain remembers that stimulus, right? Lowers it. That's why, I'll skip this one, right? They've done these studies where they've gone ahead and shown people who were former addicts, they would show them, for example, nature videos, right? Nothing would really happen. Once they went ahead and showed them videos that had like drug paraphernalia, that amygdala, which is in that limbic system, that does that automatic response, goes ahead and lights up. Triggers that craving. And then, right, same thing, you can go ahead and see, right, dopamine levels. You see that when they're watching the video with, or the pictures with drug paraphernalia. One of the things that we also know is that one of the reasons that your brain, right, you get these extreme cravings for the drug is because your brain literally starts killing off its own cells. So for example, this is a control brain right there. This is a brain that's been on ecstasy. Your brain kills off all of those serotonergic, the chemical in your brain that goes ahead and makes you feel good, right? Kills off those cells so that you can go ahead, because it's getting too much of it. And so when you go off, you don't return back to normal. You get that strong craving, and you end up wanting to, right, feel depressed, right? All of those symptoms that happens, withdrawal symptoms, because you end up, right, your brain is just trying to compensate for these things. And so the reason I sometimes really like stressing this thing is, one, it goes ahead and really tells us how we have to, one, address drug addiction. It's not as easy just to go ahead and say, well, just stop doing it. For the most part, they actually already want to stop. At least the majority of the people that I talk to. They'll tell you, I want to stop. Right? And they want to go ahead and they'll just say, I just want to feel better. I just want to feel normal. I know, I've got so many videos, I didn't have enough time to show you, of people that are in tears, right, saying, I know it's messing up my life, but I just don't know how. And so I think our job is to go ahead and provide some of those resources to help stuff like this, because they will go ahead and, right, sacrifice pretty much anything and everything for those drugs because they have a messed up brain. And I'll kind of end it on that. That way we leave some time for questions. Oh.